Good morning, ladies and gents, and welcome to this session on fire. When I read the news this morning on my phone, and I saw that 2 days this week have been classified as the hottest days in the world ever, record temperatures. But clearly they didn't have a thermometer down here, because that would have brought the average temperature down quite a bit, I think. Our next speaker is Devin McGranahan, and he's going to be giving the plenary session this morning. So that's a 45-minute talk. Devin is, if you've spoken to him, you'll realize he is American. He has an American accent. And he did his PhD under people like Dave Engel and Sam Fuhlendorf, so he's got quite a strong pedigree in rangeland science. He spent a year in South Africa in 2013 as a postdoc. And since then, he's been backwards and forwards and always been interested in South Africa and working in South Africa, and has published quite a bit of stuff from South Africa. And today he's going to be talking about fire in this theme. So Devin, over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everyone else. I don't know what he's talking about. As far as I know, I'm the only one without an accent around here. You all sound funny. Yeah, 20 years ago this month, I first landed in Africa. I was in my bags didn't make it with me, and I was in a freezing hostel in Windhoek, Namibia. And now I'm in a freezing chalet in the Free State, but I can text my mom and say, "Mom, I've made it. They've given me an electric blanket." At least that's in that year. At some point, I found myself in Namibia or in Zambia with a farmer, and he's going around and he's like, we know this. We know we need fire in our systems. We just don't know how to do it, how to manage it. And while he's saying that, we're in his Land Rover, and he's just striking matches and throwing them out door as we're driving around. I'm like, I can kind of get on board with this guy. I'd like to be able to help him out. So I'm hoping here that we get some of what I've been working on since then kind of contributes to some of that understanding of how we better use felt fire in burned areas. While I was out there doing that, there was a lot of work being done at the time in 2004, 2005, both in the Great Plains by my future mentors, Sam Fuhlendorf and Dave Engel, and then also Sally Archibald here in South Africa. And now I have a pretty good understanding of what the role of fire and grazing and how they interacted in a pre-European landscape, either in the prairies of North America or in the grasslands and your more mesic savannas and apparently more arid savannas in South Africa as well. So we can think about this cartoon of a landscape, right? I'm going to try to hit which is a button that does the. There we are. This sort of setup, although I have 3 patches here, should kind of look familiar from Richard Fain's talk yesterday, where you can kind of think of this as being our priority patch. This has been recently burned. You have that short stature felt there, and that's where the animals are attracted. That's where you're going to have the highest grazing intensity, the highest grazing quality, whereas there's other areas, you can think of those as reserves. That's the longest time since burned. Yesterday, we'd be talking about that as a grazing reserve. I also think of that's a fire reserve. That's where you're next. If there's an ignition, that's where you're most likely going to have fire spread. And that historically, you can think about these I have these as streams, but your fire breaks in a pre-colonial landscape would be just whatever is, whether it's rock outcroppings and now we have roads and tilled lines and all that. But so we think about the pyrrhic herbivory is this idea that you have the interaction, the natural interaction, kind of a unique disturbance of fire and grazing, and then you can recreate that with patch burn grazing, where you're going out and intentionally doing these sort of things in a managed ranch. So I now am up in eastern Montana. If you look here, we're in the northern part of we're in the northwestern Great Plains. Y'all are subtropical. We're sub-Canadian. When the wind is right, we can smell the metric system. But it's one of the highest areas of wildfire in North America. By the measures I've seen, we burn even more frequently than even cheatgrass invaded rangelands in the Great Basin. And this is just our natural fire regime. There's just a lot of rangeland, a lot of grazing up here. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's really fascinating to me. This is a map of our largest wildfire in that region. So 102,000 hectares. It took them a real long time to control this thing. And by the time it was done, you can see what just a mixed up mess of land ownership and management jurisdiction this fire ended up encompassing. So down here, this is a Native American reservation, an Indian reservation, and I don't mean to simplify the political ecology of our countries too much, but you can kind of think of that as like a homeland or in communal grazing, where it's it's the grazing in there is managed by the tribal authorities. These green patches in here is all U.S. Forest Service land. So that's federal land. It's public land. Now, it's not a national park. It's not like biodiversity conservation. It's managed for resource management conservation. And then they have these little spots here. There's, again, we use miles. So those are square miles. So you can think of those as each being about a kilometer and a half by a kilometer and a half. And that's owned by the state. And sometimes we call those school lands because it's leased for grazing. It's all rangeland. It gets leased for grazing, and then that money funds public schools, like in the States. We call it school land. But those are, then the gray area is just public, or it's just private land. That's all just private landowners' ranch land. You can see that all these little things are just they're islands in these ranches, public land that's stuck in the middle of private land. And all these lines and things denote grazing allotments. So when you're in the Forest Service is managing these, but you can even see these blue lines that subdivide the private ranches. That's where we have another agency, the Bureau of Land Management, is working with grazers to write grazing prescriptions for those areas. So this entire 102,000 hectares is grazed. A little less than half of it is private commercial rangeland, but almost all of it is under some form of federal grazing management. And this is in like one of the most libertarian states in the country. So when a fire happens on that, there's kind of this perception, and it turns into policy and certainly into practice. People are concerned about the impact of wildfire on the plants, on the soil, and the way that things that we usually move forward is that you're going to reduce stocking or defer grazing, or maybe even not graze at all for 1 or 2 seasons. And obviously, wildfires, these are unplanned, and you can see how this would be kind of problematic for someone if you have 2,000 hectare paddock over here that you're planning on grazing for the next 2 years, and all of a sudden you have animals ready to stock 2,000 hectares, and now you just don't get that for a couple of years. That could be kind of problematic. And you think about, that's a lot of land with the frequency at which we burn. That's a lot of grazing land that might not get used, and it can kind of be pulled out from under a grazer and under short notice. And on the other side, when this just becomes so predominantly the thinking, I was an expert witness for where a prescribed fire by the Forest Service got out and got onto a private land, and the landowners went and sued the government again for 2 years of lost grazing, and then an additional 2 years of like half stocking. So they're seeking damages on 4 years worth of grazing after they had a fire on their range. And I'm coming from a system where my academic work up to that point is like, we burn intentionally to stock with cattle. So I'm coming in there and thinking like, wait, we're suing for millions of dollars of lost forage when I'm burning for these animals. I'm thinking there's a disconnect there. So that's why I found this so interesting. So I'm going to walk through some of my graduate students' work in the Northern Plains that supports these different things. And I want to just say that with all that knowledge, like the pre-colonial landscape and all that stuff, a lot of the patch burn grazing stuff, Pyrrhic herbivory work in North America at least, has been focused on rangeland ecosystems, biodiversity conservation, and we've kind of said, like, we've gone to these conservation areas where cattle have been pulled off, and we'll say, oh, don't worry, we can put cows on there, it'll it'll be sustainable. Don't worry about hurting that system. And then to the guy who's bringing the cows in, we'd be like, don't worry, your cows aren't going to starve. They're going to be fine. So we're just kind of looking at, no one's ever really focused so much on the effect of prescribed burning on cattle themselves. So this is what I've kind of called from that is patch burn grazing 2.0 is where we're thinking about how do we actually benefit cattle production, not just say like, there's no net loss. So I'm just going to show you some data from these two studies. These are in North Dakota. If you can see where oops, wrong little button here. We're just adjacent. I'm in Montana now, and so I've just kind of moved a little bit west. The first one is kind of the most interesting to me because we're comparing grazing systems. We have that patch burn grazing, we have continuous grazing, we have the same pasture, it's unfenced, and animals can just wander around and wherever they want to go. And then the other system is a rotational system. Now let me say, folks, that's a perfectly fine word. We don't need another word for rotational grazing. I think the way I look at it, maybe it's too simple, is that if the basic premise of your grazing system is that you have a fence to keep animals over here for a certain period of time, open a gate, move them over here, mock the hex slope, it's like then you are doing rotational grazing. I mean, there might be 107 ways that you can do that, but that is rotational grazing. Finishing flower. So I got here is a satellite image. It's cool when you can see your treatments from space. And if anybody's really savvy, you'll say I prepared this slide for the 2020 GSSA. And I reported just on like crude protein content that first year. Now I'm giving you like all the data from all these studies as we finished it after 4 years. So this is when this thing first started. You can see we've subdivided this section into pastures, and we've burned this area, and then we come in to sample that, and you can see our burned area, and we have these little quadrats, and they're just spread all over, and we have them stratified by soil type. So all that sort of heterogeneity that's within and that we heard about yesterday, we're encapsulating that in our models and our data because we've structured that sampling around that inherent environmental heterogeneity. And at around each one, so we go to these we clip these. One of the things that I did learn from you guys when I was down here in Kirkman's lab is sheep shears is how you clip grass. And no one else in the States uses these, but sheep shears, folks. So we go and clip these, and then we're doing like a little walk around about 5 meter diameter. From that, we're counting crap, dung from and where animals are. They're pooping. If they poop, they've been there. So that's just a kind of a poor man's metric of. We have GPS collar data as well, but that's just too fancy. And then so these things get clipped up, we grind them up, and we're using NIRS, the near infrared spectroscopy, which can get you all the whole suite of forage quality data just by zapping light on it. So we get a lot of data off of that, and I'll show you some of that just now. So I don't have to talk much about why we see these effects because Richard set us up pretty well yesterday when we were talking about the dilution effect and the role of maturity of plants on their forage quality. So you can see we have 6 different measures of forage nutritive value, starting with crude protein up here. And so what I want you to focus on are these squares here. The bright green or the dark green ones here are the most recently burned patch. So that would be the priority patch. And these data are aggregated across all 4 years. So we have some of these not yet burned, because we started these pastures hadn't been burned. So I don't want to call it an unburned because we are going to burn it. It's just a matter when we get there in the 4th year. And plotted on these as well as those 2 different grazing management practices. So you can see that throughout the season, in each case, by all these measures, like we want crude protein to be high, we obviously want energy to be high. Lignin we'd like to see low, fiber we like to see low, and that's exactly what we saw throughout the season, all 4 seasons in that burned priority patch. I'm going to start saying that a lot more, and no one's going to know what I mean. And but I really do think that is a good descriptor. So using those that poop count, we get a index of preference for these different patches, and you can see this horizontal line here. That basically means that there's no preference. And if let's start on the right, we look at that continuous and the rotational stuff, especially with the rotational. I mean, they don't get a lot of choice. They're penned in literally, right? But and then even in the continuous, they're just out and about, just grazing wherever they want to be. But in that, we can see the priority patch here. Strong preference throughout the grazing season for that recently burned patch. But what I think is really interesting, and remember, this is Northern Hemisphere, so we're grazing seasons going from May through September is our summer, is this decline in the priority patch with a concomitant increase in the patch that was burned last year. And you can see that they've pretty much ignored it throughout that season. So that's that rest that everyone was talking about yesterday morning. But then this is a very dry period for us, and these are C3 dominated grasslands. And so you can imagine that when it gets hot, when it's up around 30, 35, 40 degrees Celsius in this period, those C3 grasses aren't producing very much. But over here, this area had been rested. And so those cows are just taking themselves over there. Remember, these are unfenced. So they've moved from the priority patch to the reserve patch on their own. And so when we're using the spatially discrete fire without fences in there, some of these concerns that Kevin's like, oh, you got to get it right. You look at your forage availability, your days grazing, all this stuff. You got to get that rotation right. These cows just wandered over there and found it themselves. You can see they ignored the reserve. They stayed out of that area. They stayed in the priority patch without any hex or fences or any of that sort of stuff. So, we saw similar trends for the sheep that we were studying out in western North Dakota as well. The grad student I had on this was really savvy. She's a beef producer. She's from Canada. Simultaneously from ranch in Western Canada, simultaneously made our lab both more liberal and more redneck at the same time. I don't know how that's Canadians for you, but she was really interested in animal performance. So she went into the literature and found what the recommendations are for the net energy of maintenance that's required to keep a domestic or to keep a lactating cow going through the summer. And then we just calculated with, remember, we had all those quadrats all spread around in the different patches and stuff. We were just like, what proportion, if you imagine those quadrats as being feeding stations, which is what we're really trying to sample here, what proportion of the feeding stations in each of those patches are going to satisfy the cow's nutritional requirements? So what's the probability of a cow putting her face down and finding what she needs? And you can see these are extensive rangelands, so it's even our best isn't very good, right? But you can see that this priority patch, our burned patch, consistently above 30% of the time, if the cow is in a burned patch, in the priority patch, if she puts her face down, she's going to get the nutrition that she needs. And you can see over here in the continuous and rotational grazing, that doesn't happen very often. And very rarely was there more than a 25% chance that cow puts her face down and finds the nutrition that she needs. And so you can probably imagine where I'm going with this. Nope, I have even more before we get to the punchline with it. She was also interested in mineral concentrations, and there's not a lot of data on that out there. I was kind of surprised. I didn't expect her to find this. As a good mentor will be like, oh, okay, that's a cute idea. We have some samples, send them to the lab and let's see. And I was shocked to see these really pronounced results on a lot of these minerals, where you can see here, there's a lot of seasonal variability, but that priority patch, look at zinc, let's zoom in on zinc. This line, she's going into the literature and finding like, what are the nutritional requirements for an animal? That's what all those horizontal lines are. And only that priority patch, only that recently burned patch met zinc requirements. You can see how whopping those were later in the season. Iron was probably the only one where we didn't see much of a response. They're not getting as much copper as they need, but they're getting the most copper out there from that burned patch. So no one's going to stop supplementing animals when there's fire out there, but you can imagine it's I think you all would call it lick. If you're putting out a little bit less lick every season, those are marginal financial gains to the farmer. It just reduces their operating costs. So with all that coming together, you can see that our patch burn pastures were the only ones, and these are aggregated across 4 years that include a drought. We started burning in a drought. It was the only ones where our cows came off weighing, having had significant gains. And so in the final chapter of Megan's thesis here, she broke this down, not just in the cows, but she looked at cows and their calves by their age, mature cows versus young cows. I think there was a reference yesterday about how your productivity with cows don't really start producing for you until they're about 3 to 5 years old. And so it's called lifetime maternal productivity. You want to have a cow who's putting out big calves as long as she can before you're selling her off. Your investment starts to pay off at 3 to 5 years. And so you want to keep cows producing calves through there. So we found that whether you have a heavy calf or not was dependent on the cow's age. Stands to reason. Mature cows produced heavier calves. Mature cows, well, all cows, but especially mature cows coming off areas with fire, were producing the best calves. So the cows that we want to see that we're investing in, our older cows, are the ones who are benefiting from this fire thing the most. So when you think about cow-calf operations and the lifetime productivity of cows, we see these accruing benefits of fire. We can just dig around in the ground a little bit. This is some of those things we talked about this a little bit yesterday. Right? These are two important plant available nutrients, sort of species of nitrogen. Right after the fire, you get this spike of ammonia, and then that stimulates a lot of the nitrogen cycle. And so then 7 months later, we're seeing this dramatic increase in nitrate because and a lot of that is attributable to microorganisms, which I'll show you, but. These are some data from some long neglected grasslands. There have been formerly crop fields. They got seeded to perennial grasses in the 80s and then just pretty much left. I mean, they've been grazed a little bit, but they've never been burned. And you can see that after we started burning, we boosted soil nitrogen and total soil carbon dramatically in both of those systems. So these are ecologically moribund grasslands that we kind of jolted back to life with fire. Soil microbes, they're pretty resilient. So this is a before after a Baki sort of design where we saw a decline in soil microbes in that top. These are 5 centimeter samples right after the fire, but they pretty much all rebounded within a week. So that's that soil mineralization, nitrogen mineralization that we're seeing there. The reason you can get this is the heating is really limited to the soil surface in a grassland. We had thermocouples on the soil surface and used a soil heating model. And what I think is interesting is even though our fuels were pretty consistent, most of this variability came from the time of day, starting a fire at 9 in the morning versus 3 in the afternoon. So you can see that some of our fires had surface temperatures below 200 degrees Celsius, and some of them were above 400 degrees Celsius. That's a really wide range of heat input on the soil surface. But by the time you're a centimeter down, all those fires are pretty much back to 100 degrees. And then you can see how cool it gets under there. Soil is a great insulator, and grasslands just don't have enough big stuff to catch fire and hold heat. And so that fire pretty much flashes right over before anything a couple centimeters below gets heated. So it's this huge variability here that comes down to being a pretty low effect down there. That makes me think that even during wildfires in grasslands, we probably have opportunities for grazing, and some of these concerns that people have we actually see the reverse on that. And I had the opportunity to test that. We had a wildfire on our research station, and it's a good opportunity, I guess, because wildfire, you don't know where they are. So nobody can go out there and like, oh, I'm going to pre-sample that wildfire. If somebody can tell you where and when a wildfire is occurring, we have a word for that, and that's called an arsonist. And so it's very rarely do you get a wildfire that goes through your plots. And we had one there, so it slipped out of a prescribed fire unit and took off with the wind, left us with 364 hectares of lemons, which we applied for a grant and got to study this, and so that's what we've called it, the lemonade fire. We've turned those lemons into lemonade, and you can see that we've used satellite products here to map the severity of that, which we've nested to get to this question of like, okay, well, maybe wildfires are more severe than prescribed fires. And like, oh, well, we'll measure things in terms of severity. We got this grant, and then we worked together with producers. I don't know if co-produced science or co-production of science is a big thing for y'all down here, but I've really come to enjoy it. So we get some stakeholders, basically people that represent all that mishmash of management and ownership that I showed you in that big fire. We got to the table here and say like, well, what do you guys want to know about wildfire and grazing responses? And we built our study around that. So we sampled soils, vegetation, and pollinators, which isn't really something you'll talk about too much here, but I'll show you some data. All right, here's an image of our soil sampling. We've structured it by the severity, like I said, but then also ecological site. It's like soils, but it takes into account where you're at on the landscape and this sort of stuff too. Don't think Kevin and I have talked about something. You don't have ecological sites really in South Africa, right? And I think it's really useful stuff for structure for encompassing the environmental heterogeneity when you're doing so. So like I said, we had some pre-fire stuff, and then we did these soil samples. These are our vegetation plots. You can see the same soil layout. And then we've paired burned and unburned plots across that. We put exclosures. So it was grazed the year after the fire. Put cows out there, but then we put exclosures so we could clip and keep control out of that. So I thought this was really interesting. Only where we had high severity, and now remember this severity is relative to itself, like in the fire. These weren't like super severe fires. If you went to a wildfire in a forest out west, it would be way, way, way more intense. But this is, and more severe. But this is the highest severity within our fire. That's where we saw these increases in soil nutrients. Everything else declined. And we talked about those seasonal declines yesterday, but this late season wildfire actually in the high severity areas actually reversed or mitigated those seasonal declines. And we saw it with the soil microbes as well. It's just that the biology just kind of slows down there during the dry season. It was only our high severity stuff where you saw that biology going. So that's going to be mineralizing nitrogen for us when everybody else would have been taking a vacation for the summer had it not been for the fire. And so we got pretty good growth. You can see that we had competitive growth between the burned and the unburned. The difference, of course, being that the unburned stuff has however many years of accumulated dead stuff that cows don't want to eat anyway. I don't have the forage quality results for this for you, but you can see in May, yeah, it's pretty low because we need this stuff to start growing up, and grow up it did, though. Competitive, and like on some of these sites, actually higher than the unburned areas, although there's a lot of variability around that. Here's our pollinators. I thought this was pretty interesting. These are just two bee families across the burned and the unburned. There's a lot of temporal variability, so it's more like whether it burned or not. It's really important that we have some unburned areas clearly in the landscape, because pollinators are using those both different taxa and different times of the year. And so I think there's an argument for planned prescribed fire, because do you want to have this was a 7,000 acre pasture. Do you want to have 900 acres of your 7,000 hectare thing burn when you want it and plant it, or do you want it? You're just going to wait for lightning and get 102,000 hectares of burn? These bees aren't going to find much unburned area in a 102,000 hectare fire. So I come back from that saying when you're looking at rangelands, herbaceous, grassy dominated, fuel beds where you're not getting that massive soil heating, very little impact. I see about the same things that I expect with prescribed fire as with wildfire. And there's been some other major wildfires in the region that show very similar results in that. If we can take a moment to turn this over to y'all, I mean, I'm not really saying anything new to most of you about the role of fire in grazing management. Africa has a lot of fire. It's had a lot of fire for a long time. And especially in South Africa, there's been a long history of veld fire research. Now, this hasn't been the way that we've always looked at fire in Africa. The early colonialists were pretty down on fire. They saw it as wasteful, mostly because they wanted to do forestry, and there's some of the same questions about like with afforestation and all that, right? But they're just like, oh, we're going to come down here, we're going to plant some trees, and there's godforsaken land, and then everybody's just burning it all the time and growing great crops and growing great cattle. I don't know what this is all about. And so this is even Phillips was seen as somebody who's like kind of an advocate or knew a lot about fire all across Africa. And I summarized, I had it as a table where he was just kind of giving his objective ratings on what fire does for these various things. This table was published in 1968, and you can see even one of the people that we associate with being like a fire guy in Africa is pretty down on fire in the 60s. But the GSSA has not been as down on fire. In veld fire research, they're good, pretty good for the time, especially setting up plots with controlled burns and all that, and a lot of good data began to be done in South Africa even before the 1920s. Around the First World War, Frankenwald studies and all that were. And so we've heard some about this special issue that the journal is doing for like I think next year or something. And so Kevin and I have worked on focusing on a review of fire studies in GSSA, and I found 266 papers since 1996 that were really about fire. And you can see that most of them are primary research. There's a lot of reviews. Now you might wonder what is an indirect versus a direct focus on fire. Something that I found really interesting about your fire research is a lot of times you're reporting on burned felt, how to manage burned felt, but fire wasn't part of the experiment. And in a lot of cases, some of the first thing in the materials and methods section is like, we burned everything prior to doing the study. That's like how you prepare a site for research, is to go burn it all off. And then you'll stock it at different intensities, and you'll stock it in different seasons. But the understanding is that we're going to graze burned felt. So, and it's like, it's not in the States, you're like, oh, but where's your unburned control? And everybody's like, yeah, where's our unburned control? This place burns all the time, and then we're going to go graze it. So I love that. So I saw a lot of that work as fire research, but it's not studying fire. It's studying how to manage burned rangeland, which, so then you go back to the States, we're like, can't graze it for 2 years. And you're like, these guys just burn it before they even start research. So you can see that, not surprisingly, for the Grassland Society of Southern Africa, grasses has been your major focus of research, and there are a lot on woody plants. So just looking over time, obviously management and ecology are closely linked, but I think we can all understand how when you're motivated to do a study, you're thinking about, how do I manage this felt, or is it how am I just kind of curious about the ecology of this felt? And you've clearly focused on the management angle since 1996 or 1966 straight through, but there's been a lot of ecology. Y'all didn't start doing ecology and fire until the late 70s, but then I kind of caught up, and you can see the slope of that line increasing. There's a lot more ecological inquiry. This line here is just when y'all change the journal name from being the proceedings of this meeting to try to open up to a broader audience. And then down here, it's like when people take it, like, why should you care about the research? What's the application of that? This is all agricultural production. That's been dominant, right? So these are agricultural landscapes. We're talking about how you're going to raise livestock on them. But you can see here that conservation and ecology have crept up. So you're studying fire and what the ecology of that system is, or how you can use it for conservation. Then I'm focused on biodiversity there when I say conservation. So you can see that increasing. this is out of 111 like primary research, where it's no reviews, no book reviews. That stuff is just sitting. And then 11 of these papers are really influential. They're really homed in on fire itself. And so it's Winston Trollope, of course, and then the Eversons. And I put Trollope's plural because Linda got in on that. Maybe not in the journal papers in the 80s, but in the subsequent work on that, and the Eversons from the Drakensberg. So if you're just asking me as a foreigner, as an outsider, like what is really notable about the research from Africa and what it contributes to what we know about fire in rangelands, and just this whole idea of open ecosystems in general, the functional role of burned and unburned areas that Richard was talking about. He's been on that kick in international literature for quite a while now, and I think that's a really good story there. That's really helpful for us. And just how resilient these systems are to pretty frequent fire. You think of the Brotherton trials in Ukalinga, but then also just this value of high intensity fire that what von Wilgen had called the curse of moderate prescribed fire. There are some species, some ecosystems that really need some high intensity fire. We shouldn't be afraid of severity. And I think I showed you some data where we saw ecosystem benefits of severity in our soils, especially. So with that, I'll wrap up and be happy to take any questions. I think we have some time. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Devin. That was also very insightful and very interesting. And I'm sure there's going to be a number of questions. Who's first? Matthew.
Is it on? So you spoke about fire severity, and there are several drivers of fire severity. So it can be the fuel structure, so where the fuel load is positioned within the sword, whether it's closer to the ground or higher up, woody species, etc. You spoke about forest fires. But one of the biggest drivers of fire severity is fire spread type, so head fires versus backfires. So backfires have their heat load closer to the ground, whereas head fires have their heat load higher up. And head fires are very chaotic, inefficient combustion. They're often less severe, although they're always more intense. They're often less severe than backfires. Where I'm getting at is runaway or unplanned fires are mostly head fire, and they can be less severe. And planned fires, so the nature of how we do control burns, are generally backfires. What proportion of your control burns are backfire versus head fire? And did you consider the head fire versus backfire scenario in your unplanned fires?
Well, with the microphone, I guess you all got that. So that's great, and you're right on. I think that is sort of the irony of this to me, is they're like, whoa, the wildfire is going to be higher severity or whatever. And when this fire got out, I got the head fire behavior that I wanted, just on the wrong side of the fence, right? Because it's the same day, it was the same winds. I was in prescription. It's just that, so you can see here, you can see where we started our prescribed fire was over here. And this fire behavior was just supposed to be up here, but by the time we got that wrapped around. And the most contiguous and highest severity in this whole unit was our initial backing fire. This was going up a slope through really thick sagebrush. And we moonscaped that. And down here, you can see, especially after it got later in the day and the relative humidity was recovering, that head fire was whisking it across the top. You'll see almost like a canopy fire in grass as it moves through the head fires, whipping the flames or pushing through the standing stems and standing canopy of the grass, and then maybe you get some post frontal combustion in the litter there, but you don't get that cooking down because it's not, we talk about it's like chewing through, into the wind. So you're right on. There's a few high severity places in the wildfire where it was going up slopes and stuff, even late into the night. But again, it's that it's backing. It's whether it's going into the wind or whether it's going like down slope. That's essentially a backing fire as well. So my colleague Chris Awanka has pointed out that now with like Kanza Prairie, where they've been burning for decades now, you can and they doing about the same prescription, the same ignition plan on a unit or a watershed each time. You can go out there and you can see like here's where the backing fire was, and then here's where the head fire came in, because they put that same fire type on that side of the burn unit every time they burn for like the last 30 or 40 years. And there's vegetation differences. So that stuff's really interesting, nuanced stuff. And so we are seeing some of that. And I think that it's actually, you'll find that a wildfire will be less severe just because it is mostly wind driven and pushed along like that. So thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. Urs is next.
Great talk, Devin. I had one clarification in the review that you did. You just had one line, which is when the journal changed, the African Journal of Range and Forest Science. But there was a change previously from Proceedings to the Journal of the Grassland Society of Southern Africa. Did you include the work in the Proceedings in your review?
Yeah, that work was included. I started at 1966.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, I as a reader, going through it, I didn't really see any. So I didn't see like a substantive change in that title. Like the presentation, you still have Afrikaans abstracts, you still have Afrikaans papers. You haven't seen any of that with the shift to what I saw as appealing to a more international ecological audience, and so that's why I denoted that.
Yeah, probably not. There was a big difference in that the proceedings were published once a year, whereas after that there were quarterlies. And so I don't know if you want to put that in there when you submit it. But the question that I really had was throughout the United States, there's resistance to using prescribed fire because of the liability concerns, mainly other concerns too, but liability concerns. And particularly in the northern Great Plains, my understanding is there's much greater resistance than there is in the southern Great Plains. With the stuff that you're doing, are you picking up any changes in perspective on the part of landowners that they're more willing to burn their land, or is that resistance persistent?
It's a really interesting question, and it still is relevant to South Africa as well. Some other stuff that Kevin and I have worked on. We've looked at liability and some of the regulations in South Africa, and you're still pretty, from a legal standpoint, driven by forest people and plantation people that are just like, we don't want our forests to burn, and one of the best ways for our gum trees to not burn, the gum trees we planted in this grassland to not burn, is if none of you guys burn either. And so you're, and we're in a similar situation in the States. It varies a lot in the States, and I guess I'm glad I have this map up too. So I was working initially in North Dakota, where just like, they don't want to talk about prescribed fire. There is just no uptake on prescribed fire. It's not going anywhere. A lot of that is it's legal, but they see the loss of forage as a problem. Why would I burn up stuff when I might need to graze it? So then now I'm just across the state line here, and it's a different world. People are interested in fire. I think liability and resources, and they're just like, how am I going to pull it off? But they're starting to see woody encroachment becoming an issue. We see what's happening in the southern plains with juniper encroachment. So I've been just shocked by the number of landowners I've talked to that's like, yeah, let's talk about fire. They're not ready to do it because they don't know how to do it, and then liability is kind of an open question. But everyone is receptive to fire. And I think it's because there's just so much wildfire. We have so much rangeland. There's so much wildfire. They know it's going to burn. And it's a question of whether they get to control it or whether it's going to be coming at their house. So I think that's kind of a motivating factor as well. But I've been very pleasantly surprised with Montana and how open they are to fire.
Thank you. And I think we've come to the end of the time available for now. One more online. Okay, we can take the one more online.
Debbie is asking, what was the outcome of the court case, i.e., what is the legal support for the burning?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. They didn't. I don't really know, but I do know that with that using my report, the damages were brought down considerably. With that, is that the plaintiffs did not get compensated for 4 years of lost forage. They didn't get compensated for rebuilding all of their fences. They send this picture of like how burned out look how burned out my wooden post is, and you zoom in on it, and that barbed wire, that post is an old cedar post. It's been there since it's about 100 years old, and that barbed wire is just patched up. And I'm like, there's no reason that the government needs to buy you a whole brand new fence when that thing is about ready to fall over anyway. So that it's like, in that sense, the system works, but especially on the forage side, it was responsive to that argument that fire's natural, and you probably got, we have the data from that fire that shows you actually got more grass after that, so you should have had cows out there.
Okay, thanks a lot. We're going to move on with the rest of the program now, but as a token of appreciation to Devin for the plenary address, there we go.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. And the next speaker is Matthew Dankwitz, and he's going to be talking about fire investigation. So I think the question that Debbie asked a moment ago, she might pose to Matthew again after his talk. Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks. Yeah, I think those questions set my talk up quite nicely. Well, we all know I'm talking about fire investigations. So most fire investigations relate to structural fires, and wildfire investigation is a bit of a niche topic, and it requires specialist expertise, of course. It's grounded in the science of combustion and science of fire behavior in natural vegetation, and as we've spoken about, after wildfires occur, damage is often incurred, and fire investigations might be commissioned by lawyers or insurance companies or whoever. So the purpose of wildfire investigation is firstly to claim on one's own insurance sometimes, if you've got a stubborn insurance company, or to claim against a third party. And in the latter case, someone must be liable, or the legal terminology, negligent. So if liability is contested, the outcome will depend on eyewitness evidence, scientific fact, and legal argument. But a fire investigator's role is strictly limited to the science, and we leave the legal arguments to the lawyers. So there are three main aspects of wildfire investigation. So firstly, where and how did the fire start? How did it spread, and what was its extent? And secondly, could anything reasonable have been done by the landowners to prevent the fire spread? And that's not limited to the landowner where the fire started. If the fire spread onto a number of farms, it gets applied to each farm. And then thirdly, what is the quantum of the damage? So in South Africa, we generally separate the merits of the case and the quantum of the case. So I'm sure Debbie will have a question about this later. But the outcome of the merits is one aspect, and then they only argue or usually settle on the quantum. So just to touch quickly on fire breaks. So it's popular belief that the preparation of fire breaks is an adequate means to prevent the spread of fires. And there's a legal obligation on landowners to prepare fire breaks. It's in one of the acts. But from a scientific perspective, fire breaks don't necessarily confer such protection, and it's often proved in practice. Runaway head fires, they jump fire breaks all the time. You just have to drive between Bloemfontein and here in spring, and you'll see the number of fires that have crossed the N1. But yeah, fire investigators use rate of spread simulations and fire intensity simulations to determine whether a fire would or could have cost of fire break had there been one. Yeah, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. This is just a paper that looked at the efficacy of fire breaks of different widths, but basically, once fire intensity exceeds 4,000 kilowatts, it renders fire breaks essentially ineffective. So let's move on to the investigation of the source and spread of the fire. So on the left-hand figure there is a figure that shows kind of what active fire looks like. So you've got the head fire at the top, the flanks on the sides, which alternate between flanking and backing fires with small fluctuations in wind direction. And then your backfire spreading against the wind near the base. The shape of active fires is generally like an oval or spear shape, and then as they burn out, they generally create a V or U shape. So one would expect the ignition point to be somewhere near the base of the fire, and that's where we conduct our investigations and look for various indicators to pinpoint the specific point of ignition. So I don't know how well you guys can see that, but that's just an example of a fire scar. And looking at that U or V shape, one would expect the ignition area to be somewhere around there. And then that's where we'd conduct our detailed inspection. That's just an example of some satellite imagery which shows active fires, and we can use that to get a approximate time of ignition. Here we've got another example of fire scar, and I think you'd all think, having looked at that the ignition area would probably be somewhere around there. But it's not always so simple. In this case, there were several fires downwind of the fire scar. And when you look at it with closer detail and you remove the cloud cover and shadows, there's an active fire that was picked up by satellite imagery. And that in this case, that ended up being responsible for almost half the damage of the area that was damaged. So, yeah. And then it's not always so clear. Sometimes you get a fire scar that looks something like that, and it gets a bit more complex, and you rely quite heavily on eyewitness evidence and active fire data and any other information you can gather. So moving on to the indicators we use to pinpoint the point of ignition. This is an example of ash patterns. So in head fires, we spoke about this already. I think head fires are more intense. There's more chaotic combustion. They're less efficient, and they leave black ash. And then backfires, the opposite applies. They have quite efficient combustion and leave white ash. So what we're looking at here is the flank of a fire, and it's alternated between back and heading fire, and it's created this zebra effect, white and black ash. Not always that common. Just to elaborate on what I spoke about, I'm not talking about smoke though, there's a backfire and a headfire approaching each other. It's wind and slope in this case, and the backfire has white smoke, and I don't know how well you guys can see it, but there's more black smoke above the headfire, a sign of incomplete combustion. This is one of the most reliable indicators we have. It's an indicator of backfire spread. So it's the undercutting of stems and culms. So as a backfire approaches a sword, the flames are leaning over the burnt fuel, and the base of the flames consume the base of the culms or stems. And the wind blows the culms or stems over the burnt fuel to land on over the flames to land on the burnt ground. That's what it looks like, more or less. And then a closer view of the actual culms, you can see where I don't know if you guys can see, but I can see on my laptop, where they were burnt close to the base. Just another example of what we're looking for. And this is just out of my master's work. Just showing the abundance of columns in head and back fires. This is an example of lease out charring. What happened? This is a good indicator of wind direction. The flames are drawn into an eddy or vortex flame wrap on the leeward side of the pole type fuel, and the flame wrap chars the leeward side of the pole more than the windward side. It's also a very reliable indicator. That's what it looks like afterwards and what we're looking for. And then, leaf freeze, I think, also an indicator of wind direction. I'm not going to elaborate too much. Angle of char, so the angle of the flames affect how a tussock can be consumed or burnt. Spalling, this is quite an interesting one. So this can be an indication of lightning, but it also occurs in very intense fires. This example is from Tabazimbi in Limpopo, which roughly translates to mountain of iron. And those rocks, they have a very high iron content. So there's a lot of lightning strikes which cause fires there. And then we have protection indicators. There are various other indicators as well. And they're not all so reliable. And I did a bit of research in my master's thesis, which just showed how reliable or unreliable various indicators are. So knowing what we know now, this slide. There has been published research recently. This was this year. They beat me to it. And in this paper, in the experiments, they recorded the fire behavior as it passed. They took photographs of each indicator, and then they sent the photographs off to 4 independent investigators, and they independently assessed each photograph. And what they found, the results indicated that there was an average error of 103 degrees, which is quite large in directional indicators. So these indicators aren't all so reliable. So knowing what we know now, if we have some beer bottles and concentrated heavy fuels, that would be an indicator of fire. So once we have all these indicators in our origin area, we can draw a little map like this and kind of pinpoint where the precise point of origin would be. And it can be quite complex. You sometimes have to just accept that there's an area and you can't get a precise point. And obviously, I now draw digital maps, not hand drawings. Okay, and then when we've got our precise point of origin, we start looking for causes of ignition, and that is an aluminium droplet from a faulty power line, which I found at a fire last year. There were hundreds of these, by the way. It's fascinating. So just a point on ignition sources. Ignition sources usually have to be high total energy, such as like an open flame, electrical flashover, or molten metal droplets, like I showed above. Most felt fires burn under circumstances where fuel moisture content is in excess of 15%. That's total fuel moisture, not dry fuel moisture. And only a sustained flame can cause ignition, or high total energy ignition sources. So items such as cigarette butts, glowing carbon particles from defective exhaust from generators, etc., and sparks from clashes of metal and rock don't usually cause felt fires. And you might all disagree with me on the cigarette butts, but it's just purely the number of cigarettes that are out there. But once fuel moisture drops below 6%, these factors come into play. Just a bit more on this. This can become really relevant when it comes to negligence and whether someone would be considered to have been liable for the cause of a fire. I did a case where a farmer was using a bushwhacker or bush thrasher, whatever it's called, a mower, to widen his fire break, so to protect against fire. He hit a rock, caused a sliver of metal to land on some dry grass and start a fire, and he got sued for 20 million rand. Yeah, so that's still ongoing, but we've argued the case. We're just waiting for the judgment on that one. So yeah, just finally liability. To be liable, a landowner needs to have been negligent. When liability is cut and dried, us fire investigators, lawyers aren't usually needed, and the matter is usually settled out of court. But it's when claims are contested and things are uncertain that litigation happens, and evidence for negligence, needs to be found. In a fire claim context, negligence is a legal term. Its interpretation is outside the expertise of fire investigators. Fire investigators and eyewitnesses merely present the facts on which the lawyers base their arguments. While useful for fire investigators to understand the law, one should always avoid legal opinions or arguments at all costs. Advocates are sharp, they'll catch you out. At the end of the day, expert witnesses are there to assist the court, and we shouldn't be taking sides. So, yeah, I think that's saying render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's is quite pertinent. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. And your timing is excellent, but there's still 50 seconds available for questions. So do we have any questions from the audience, please? Yes.
Hi. I just want to ask you, in case of arson fire, especially in situations where people cause fires for poaching and all of those things, and then they end up being runaway fires and damaged property, how are those being handled during investigations, and who ends up being liable for those kind of fires?
That's a difficult one, because it's very difficult to find the person who lit the fire, and often when you do, the person doesn't have many assets, so you can't really litigate. But it's important to note that if a fire starts on your property, there will always be some form of contributory negligence. So you will be liable. You have to prevent people from coming onto your property and starting fires.
Just a question on ember fires. You didn't mention ember fires. Do we know anything about ember fires in South Africa? There seems to be a major problem where the veld hits cities and cause enormous amounts of damage. But you don't mention them at all here, and I was wondering what's going on.
I was just a bit limited with time. I could spend the whole day talking about spot fires or ember fires. There's a lot of literature on it, but also a lot more work that needs to be done. That 4,000 kilowatts that I spoke about, that's when spotting usually occurs. So there's enough intensity to cause updrafts, and there's convection which blows these embers up above the flames, and then they're transported by wind to cause lots of fires. It happens in pretty much all our runaway fires. I know at UCT, that fire a few years ago, there were palm trees on main road a few kilometers away from the mountain, which were burning from spot fires. So yeah, it is a problem, and that's why fire breaks are ineffective.
Thanks a lot. And we need to move on to the next one. Time's up, but thank you. Thanks a lot, Matthew. That was a very interesting talk. And we are moving on to the next talk, and that is Nothando Ngobeni. And that talk is also going to be an interesting one on the effect of time of day on factors that affect fire intensity. I think Devin has referred to time of day in one of his graphs, and Matthew has also touched on that. So thank you. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you. Okay, it looks like I'm of the same size with the podium, but at least you can see my head. As introduced, I am Nothando Ngobeni. I am a fire researcher working on fire and an MSc student at UNISA. Firstly, I would like to thank the Grassland Society for awarding me this opportunity to come and present here. It is my first time attending the Congress, and I must say it's a goal achieved. And also, thank you for the socks. I'm wearing them today. They're so warm, cute, and comfortable. So allow me today to take you through one of the projects that I did that focus on the effect of time of day on factors that affect fire intensity in the Southern African savannas. Okay, I'm sure there's someone who's sitting there wondering, she's talking about a savanna. What is a savanna? So just to take you through and not to confuse you, I am talking about the one on my left-hand side, the left. So let's just forget about the angry one at the moment. We might talk about it later. So what is a savanna ecosystem? A savanna ecosystem is broadly explained as an ecosystem that has grasses and trees coexisting together in it. But the grasses form a continuous layer of fuel, and the trees are in a form of they're scattered in the ecosystem. So this ecosystem depends on three things. Those things are very important. The first one is watering nutrients. The second one is herbivory. The third one is fire. Those factors are very important to and make sure that the ecosystem is well balanced and it keeps it maintains its ecological status. But at the moment, let's talk about fires. They are my favorite. So we know that fire has been accepted as an ecological management tool in savanna ecosystem. It helps in maintaining the ecosystem and keeping it balanced. But before you start burning, you need to understand the effects. You need to understand fire intensity first and the behavior of fire. So what is fire intensity? Fire intensity refers to the level of energy of heat released by fire per unit in an area. It is influenced by weather conditions and fuel characteristics. By weather conditions, I'm referring to wind speed, relative humidity, air temperature. And by fuel characteristics, I'll make an example. If like the grasses, I said before that they form a continuous layer. In that manner, you are able to have a continuous burn. So fire intensity is a tool that managers use in most protected areas to achieve different outcomes. So they usually use cool fires to achieve heterogeneity, and they use hot fires to top kill trees. According to the management guidelines, usually they relate to seasonal variations in fire intensity, but I believe that burning at a different time of day, you can also achieve a range of fire intensities. So for this project, I aimed to assess the range of fire intensity that can be achieved over a 24-hour period in the early dry season and the late dry season. But please note, the results that I'm going to give are based on the early dry season. Maybe next year, if I'm accepted again, I'll give the late dry season results and maybe both combined. So I investigated whether fuel characteristics and weather conditions affected fire intensity among fires that were set at different times of day. And I also investigated whether fire occurring in the day is more intense than fires occurring in the early mornings and late afternoons. Substantial variation in fire intensity was obtained by just changing the time of day that we burned. However, we can still use time of day as a management tool. Remember, I mentioned before that they usually focus on the seasonality, but I thought as much, let me just look at the time of day and see. So I conducted this study in the Kruger National Park on the Lower Sabi Basaltic super site. We laid 24 1-hectare plots. 20 of them were the actual ones that we banned, and the 4 plots were control plots. The reason why we included control plots is because there were other projects on soils that were going on in the same area. So for the pre-sampling, collected grass biomass using a dispastiometer that was specifically calibrated for the Kruger National Park. We collected 100 points per plots. And for fuel moisture content, we used a sickle to cut the grass in each plot. And we collected the grass and placed them in 4 console jars, which are airtight. And then we we weighed them and ovened them for 4 consecutive days at 65 degrees Celsius, which is the recommended temperature. And for when we were applying the fires, we had a weather station where we used a Kestrel to measure wind speed, relative humidity, and air temperature. And for the fire application, we used a drip torch. The Working on Fire team was actually the one that was conducting the burns because they're experienced and they know what they're doing. So we burned 4 to 5 times a day, and we repeated that for 3 days, having repeated times in each day. So during the fires, we measured the rate of spread using a stopwatch, and we were determining how long it takes for a fire flame to reach from one point to reach the other point. So in that case, we used trees to measure the time and the distance the flame takes. And later on, we calculated fire intensity. So for the first objectives, where we looked at investigating whether fuel characteristics or weather conditions affected fire intensity among the fires that were set at different times, we found that relative humidity decreases when temperature increases during the day towards midday around 12. And also found that relative humidity was highest and temperature was lowest in the early hours of the day, around 10 a.m., as well as late in the afternoon after 4. Wind speed in this case, as you can see in figure 2C, it was fairly inconsistent throughout the day, regardless of the time of day. We all know you can't predict wind speed. The rate of spread and fire intensity increased while the relative humidity decreased and temperature increased during the day towards the midday at around 12 and 1. And then in addition, we found that fuel moisture content was also inconsistent throughout the day, regardless of the time of day. So I think the reason why fuel moisture gave these results is because this was only conducted during the early season. So the grass had the same, so it was in the same season, even though it's different times of day, but it's the same season. So it has, like, the grass was not cured enough. So this result suggests that specific weather conditions, fire behavior, and fuel characteristics are directly affected by the time of day at which the fires were set. So for the second objective, we investigated whether fire occurring in the day is more intense than fires occurring in the early mornings. We found that in figure 4A, there is a negative correlation between relative humidity and fire intensity with an adjusted R-squared of 0.47 and P value of less than 0.01. As relative humidity increased, fire intensity decreased. The other weather variables, and fuel characteristics measured, such as wind speed, temperature, and fuel moisture content, did not suggest any correlation with the intensity, and the p-value was less than 0.05. To give a bit of a discussion of the results, the time of day at which the fires were applied has a big effect on certain weather conditions. In this case, fuel moisture content, like I said, was almost the same throughout the day in all the 3 days. The wind conditions were unstable. There was a slow moving of fires with low rates of spread in the early mornings and also in the late afternoons. And also fires spread faster during the peak of the day when the temperatures were high and the relative humidity was low. So I compared those results with a paper by Govinder et al. 2006. We found that fuel moisture content was not a strong predictor of fire intensity for this experiment, but the paper that Govinder wrote suggests that fuel moisture content varies significantly among the seasons. Remember, I measured throughout the day and she compared seasons, which makes sense to me. So there was no clear relationship between wind speed and fire intensity. Both temperature and relative humidity at this point had an effect on fire intensity, but relative humidity has a significant relationship with fire intensity. So these results are consistent with the findings of Riyad al. 2018, where he also found that relative humidity was the only variable that varied between the days. Over one day, we managed to cover about 6.94% of the range of fire intensities observed over the season in this ecosystem. Even here, I compared with the results that Govender found when she was measuring according to the seasons. Thank you for listening with great patience, and I would like to thank Working on Fire Kishugu Joint Venture with St. Parks for the collaboration and the Grassland Society for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. And that was a really interesting talk, and I think contributes a lot to our understanding of fire behavior. And Matthew will probably appreciate using some of that data in his investigations at some point. Thanks for sticking to time. We do have time for one or two questions. So open to the audience for questions. Anyone online? Nothing online? Yes.
I'm just curious, and I saw you were shaking your head, so maybe you don't want to answer the question. No, I was curious, how did you contain the fire? Because you had quite a specific area that you were burning. Or that's one part of it, and the other part is, it seemed as though there was no fuel around the area you were burning. Were there fire breaks around the plot you were burning?
Okay, thank you for your question. So what we did when we were laying the plots, we made sure that they're 100 meters apart from each other so that each burn is separate from the other. And then before applying the fire, we made sure that we apply fire breaks within all the plots.
Thanks a lot. I don't see any other hands, so thank you very much, Nothando. And I see that she escaped very fast. But I see, looking at her walking down the aisle there, she's got her jeans rolled up a bit to see the socks. And I think everyone else who's wearing the Grassland Society socks should also roll their jeans up so that we can actually see who's wearing them.
So I'll be talking about the effects of fire and rainfall variability in arid savannas. And this is a project at Tswalu Kalahari Reserve that we started 2 years ago. I started with my colleagues Tiffany Pillay and Michelle Grieve from University of Pretoria. So we don't hear that many talks at conferences about fire in arid savannas. They're generally infrequent because being dry, arid savannas typically don't have very high grass biomass, and very often they're sweetfelt areas that are also quite heavily grazed. And as you can see from this graph from Sally Archibald and Gareth Hempson's paper, at the dry end of the rainfall spectrum, the main consumer of biomass is actually herbivory rather than fire. So fire doesn't play a crucial role typically in arid savannas, but becomes more important in keeping mesic savannas in the open savanna state. But when there's some good rainfall and there's high grass biomass, and when fires do occur, they can be really large and intense with significant impacts. Last year around the Kuruman area, there have been thousands of hectares of huge wildfires. So they obviously are of concern. But at the same time, fire in arid savannas is a lot less researched, and it is hardly ever intentionally applied in management. Whether or not we get a fire and how big an area is likely to burn is strongly dependent on how much rain falls in the preceding year or two. As you can see from these graphs, on the x-axis is how much rainfall compared to the average there was in the preceding 2 seasons, and on the y-axis is the percent burnt area. And in the top row are the drier areas, and the graphs kind of go from driest to wettest, and you can see, especially in the arid savannas, how much burns is very closely related to how much rain there was in the preceding 2 years. But at the same time, the recruitment of trees is also very strongly dependent on the previous 2 seasons' rainfall, because being arid, there aren't a lot of opportunities for seedlings to establish and survive. And so, and especially when it comes to encroaching species like Acacia mellifera, these high rainfall pulses are of great concern because they can often trigger waves of encroachment. So high rainfall stimulates both stimulates tree recruitment and potentially suppresses it. And the net effect depends on whether the fires actually occur, because they don't always. Also their timing in relation to the germination and establishment and their impact. And this is of particular concern because we know the climate is changing, it's getting hotter. And there's also been records that in South Africa, wind has been increasing. So we'll very likely see more days in the year with a high fire danger index. And the change in rainfall is uncertain, but there's a very likely scenario that more extreme events will occur, and this may well also include extreme wet episodes that can lead to higher fire risk and also tree recruitment. And we know there's also been increases in tree covers linked to elevated CO2, changes in rainfall patterns, and of course, land use effects such as browsing loss and impacts of grazing. In a paper from 2017, where they modeled responses of the Kalahari to anthropogenic drivers, fire frequency was found to be the most important impact on tree cover. So it's really important that we understand what fire will do. But to understand and predict how fire changes and rainfall patterns will affect tree cover and the population size of important species, we actually need to know how different demographic transitions of the trees are affected by those factors. The production of seed, the germination of seedlings, the maturing into saplings, and then the maturing into reproductive individuals that both have a significant impact but also produce more babies. And this is likely to differ between species with different life histories, because for different species, recruitment is more important for their population persistence and growth. For others, it's the persistence of long-lived adults. So we kind of got called in to work at Tswalu in the Southern Kalahari, who had experienced 2 very wet summers a couple of years ago. And the grass was kind of hip high, beautiful, but there was a lot of concern that this would lead to extensive wildfires, and they were not really prepared for what this would mean. And the concerns are obviously that they're very difficult to control, they damage infrastructure. There's also worry that if a very large area burns and this isn't followed with good rain, that there might be a lack of forage for the wildlife. And of course, it's likely to have effects on the woody vegetation. And there on the graph, you can see those 2 really wet years, twice the annual rainfall in 2021, and then an extra 50% the following year. And Tswalu, on the whole, is still beautifully open classic savanna, but there are some areas that have experienced quite significant increase in woody cover. And if you look closely, that seems to be both the result of small trees getting big and canopies closing up, but also new recruits. So we set up demographic plots to take advantage of this potential recruitment event and to see how these the 3 key acacia species in the area respond. And those are Acacia mellifera, which is the swarthak, a known encroacher, but also the camelthorn and the grey camelthorn. We set up 25 by 25 meter plots, and we recorded, tagged, and measured every individual from the tiniest baby to the biggest tree. And with my own hands, I tagged some 1,200 individuals. And we then collected these data. We set these plots up in June 2022, and we revisited and refound these individuals, and quite a few that we missed a year later and earlier this winter. And that involves things like GPS, metal detectors, and so on. But that's allowed us to track the survival, the growth, the transitions between these demographic stages, and then to use matrix population models to see how things like rainfall variability and fire affect the population. To look at the effect of fire, we managed to burn 2 of these plots last October, and we have resampled those earlier this winter. And you can see some of the trees get top killed, some of the trees come out of it unscathed, but we were also particularly interested in what the seedlings were doing and whether they were surviving. So I'm going to focus on Acacia mellifera because we had the most individuals and it's the most dynamic. And so these were the life stages and transitions we looked at. So from little seedlings, which turned out they can stay in this size and survive for like 3 seasons. It's quite impressive. They get eaten by spring hare and all sorts. But if they survive, they then become small saplings, even bigger saplings up to 2 meters that are typically not yet reproductive, and then adults that are bigger than 2 meters and that produce seed. And they then obviously give rise to seedlings. Now, with each stage, we delineated the sort of criteria for an individual being in that stage, mostly just height. And then over a year, an individual can stay in the same size class, which is the most common fate. It can grow bigger, but they can also persist and retrogress if they get eaten by a black rhino or a spring hare, or if fire knocks them from being a 2-meter tall individual to being a little piece of coppice. And so the biology of this has been quite well documented. It flowers, it has very episodic recruitment. It only really flowers and produces seeds en masse after a very wet season. And then it flowers in August, September, and then December the seeds are ripe. So if there's a second wet year, then the seeds can germinate and establish. So it actually takes 2 years because in the first wet year, there aren't any seeds in the seed bank. It doesn't have a persistent seed bank, which is quite unusual for acacias. So what's happened at Tswalu is that before we came, in that first summer, it was super wet. And then the following summer was also very wet. And we started sampling here and there and there. And in the season before we arrived, there would have been this mass flowering event, and this is corroborated by the reserve managers. And then this summer would have been the germination of seedlings. There was a 22-day period of exceptional rainfall, and when we got there in June 2022, there were hundreds of seedlings in some of our plots. Because of tagging the seedlings, but also counting them and revisiting, we managed to see what the survival of these seedlings was. And I mean, in the unburnt plots, after 2 years, about 10% of them were still around. In the burnt plots, the initial survival was 50%, like in the unburnt, so over the first year, but the burnt plots didn't have any survive. So I worked out the transition probabilities and played around a little bit. And this is kind of a first rather crude stab at looking at what would happen if there is this big recruitment event, and the year later, there's the survival that we observed, and then the following year, and then the following sort of 7 years, it's the same sort of survival that we observed, and then it goes in 10-year cycles. So obviously not a very realistic scenario, but with the probabilities that we observed, the population actually stays remarkably stable. You get these big increases with the recruitment event, but because the seedlings die, quite a lot of them, and there is not adults dying, but some of the saplings die, and there is dieback, the population potentially is quite stable. But this is very sensitive to the values you have in your transition probabilities. And that's why we're doing this for the foreseeable future. This is a long-term project, so we can get much better handle of what happens in different years, so we can model the stochasticity more realistically and try to find out what would be situations where you might get a successful recruitment pulse that actually could spark off an episode of encroachment. When fire came into the equation, and this is a simulation where every recruitment event is followed by a fire, again, highly unrealistic, but you can see it gets completely wiped out. Fire actually is quite effective because it kills a lot of the seedlings. It causes the bigger plants to be top killed and become small unreproductive coppice. And our next years of data will tell us how long it takes for this coppice to turn into anything more significant. Of course, if you've got felt that is already heavily encroached, you're highly unlikely to get a fire through it. But also, you're not going to kill the adults, and you'll knock them back and they'll grow back. But it does look like, and this is also what Dave Joubert found from his research in Namibia, that if we get these successful pulses of recruitment, fire probably is the best option to nip encroachment in the bud. And even if you might find yourself a bit short of forage, of grass in the following year, you're probably doing a good thing for your next decades. I'm going to quickly touch on the other two species. So Acacia areoloba has a very different biology. And so we're expecting to see its response to rainfall and fire to be quite different. It's animal dispersed. We found very few seedlings, but we did find some, mostly that would have germinated in 2021-22, but we even found some new ones in June this year. The seedling survival isn't high, but it was 24%, and even though it was a below average rainfall. And they're really tough. We compared top kill in relation to size for the three species, and areoloba is really tough. It's got thick bark, and once it's 3 meter height, it's pretty guaranteed to survive top kill. And it does also resprout very vigorously after fire. And the population structure, we found there was a lot of recruitment. So the population seems stable. But there is a lot of concern about the really big individuals and what happens in fires. So in Benfontein near Kimberley, there were a couple of really hot fires. There were actually 3 hot fires in a 5-year period, and that killed a lot of the big ones. Hematoxylon is a bit of an enigma. It resprouts extremely vigorously. We never found a single seedling, and it is a total wuss when it comes to fire. Even the tallest 5 meter tall individuals just get top killed. So the population appears stable, but we're going to need more data. So to conclude, this has got a lot of promise. There's still lots more to do. So we're going to be collecting a lot more data to allow us to relate these demographics to the effects of rainfall variability, fire season, also density dependence. Our plots have, some are quite thick, others are much more open. We want to model more realistic scenario with better data. We want to link what we're seeing in our demography to reconstructing past woody cover change and how it related to rainfall. And there's a lot of other data on the ecology and ecophysiology that we can then relate to these real life proof of the pudding demographic processes. So thanks very much for your attention. My time's up.
Thank you very much, Susie. That was a really fascinating talk. And we're going to, because you're going to be leaving soon, we're going to allow time for at least one question. Yes.
Interesting stuff, burning deserts. It'll be interesting to see how things carry on. But my question, Susie, was, I noticed that in the burn plots, you had many more seedlings than in the unburned plots. And that was pre-burn, right?
Yes, I mean, that's just pure chance. The seedlings are very patchy because it's got passive dispersal. They tend to be very concentrated around a few very fecund individuals. So some plots had almost none. Some plots had very little. Some of our plots actually, also the composition differed between plots. So some plots were predominantly areoloba, so there wouldn't have been any melliferous seedlings. So that was just what there was at the beginning. And we only had 2 burnt plots and 10, well, I only analyzed 8, but a much bigger area of unburnt. So that's complete fluke. But the rate of survival was sort of around 50% in the first year. That was the same. But then with fire, there was none. And without fire, there was 20% of what had survived the previous year, giving like a 10% survival over the 2 years.
Thanks. And we'll move on to the next talk in the session, and that is by Andre van Aert. and he's going to be talking about fire on diversity and vegetation in Golden Gate, Highlands Park. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So today I want to share with you our research on the effect of annual burning on the diversity of vegetation in Golden Gate Highlands National Park. So globally, grasslands are known for their high biodiversity and the ecosystem services, but they are impacted by habitat loss, climate change, soil disturbances, extirpation of plant species, and also anthropogenic effects or activities. So grasslands is the second largest biome in South Africa, covering a third of the land surface. And this biome is also species rich, have a high species diversity, and have global centers of endemism. So grasslands cover a large part of the Free State, but has been modified through cultivation, especially by the production of maize and wheat. Less than 3% of this grasslands is formally conserved or protected, and these ecosystems contribute to the bioeconomy through carbon sequestration, pollination, act as carbon and methane sinks, as well as being regulators of regional climate. Soil carbon stocks in grasslands contribute 10 to 30% of the total carbon that is being stored globally. So the below ground storage, seasonal burning, and the regrowth of grasslands affect the global carbon cycle. And this can be destabilized in future due to the impacts of humans on the environment. So as we all know, or I hope we know, grasslands are structurally very simple and mostly dominated by grasses, with their cover dependent on moisture, grazing, and the fire regime and soil fertility. So fire is vital in the maintenance of the structure and the textural patterns of these grasslands. Together fire and herbivores have shaped the grasslands long before the existence of humans, and the use of incorrect fire management practices can result in the reduction of biodiversity. So fire is widely used as a management tool nowadays to maintain the vigor and palatability of the vegetation. And in the grassland, especially in Golden Gate, the sour grasslands, is recommended to occur every 1 to 4 years during late winter. There are various studies in South Africa that investigate the effect of fire on vegetation. However, very limited studies on the effects of fire breaks on vegetation. So fire breaks are fixed on a property, and normally the same area is subjected to annual fires. These areas can comprise roughly 10% of the surface area of such a property. And there are differences of opinion on the effects that fire breaks might have on the diversity, which range from marginal to a change in species and nutrient composition. So due to the negative effect that fire have on biodiversity, human health, and the economy, the National Veld Fire and Forest Act was instated, which made fire breaks along the borders of properties compulsory. But now we've heard that fire breaks is not actually working so. As a state-owned enterprise, Golden Gate Highlands National Park is therefore obliged to make these fire breaks and ensure that their property are protected, or that they protect other properties from fires that actually start within the park. So they prepare their fire breaks by cutting the vegetation by hand or using brush cutters or bossy cuppers. And the fire breaks inside the park can vary from 50 to 70 meters, mostly along roads and all of their infrastructure. They also prepare these fire breaks using backfires, and in their case, they determine fuel load visually. However, after good summer rainfall, the fuel load normally is high, and they need to prepare the fire breaks. So our study was initiated after we had a discussion with the park manager, who posed the question to us, What is the effect of annual fire breaks on the biodiversity of the vegetation? So therefore, the aim of our study was to investigate the effect of annual burning of fire breaks on vegetation composition, the species diversity, as well as look at the soil carbon and nitrogen. So the study site by now everybody knows Golden Gate Highlands National Park, approximately 32,000 hectares of the grassland biome, with a topography that range from 1,800 to 2,900 meters above mean sea level, and rainfall mostly occurring in the summer months from November to April in the form of thunderstorms. The vegetation in the park is composed of 5 different vegetation types that you guys can see in the map that I've prepared for you. However, for this study, we will focus on the Eastern Free State sandy grassland that's indicated in yellow. This vegetation type in the Free State, normally dominated by grasses. However, the diversity of this vegetation type lies in the herb layer, which is mostly from the family Asteraceae. And the fire break that we investigated in this case is indicated in red there on the road to Gestel. So if we get to the materials and methods, we prepared or made 24 pair plots consisting of a fire break and an adjacent grassland plot that were placed in similar environmental conditions where slope and topography were kept more or less similar. And then the adjacent grassland plots were set out roughly 20 meters from the edge of the fire break. These plots were fixed at 16 square meters, and the Bronblanquet cover abundance values were assigned to each and every species that was found within the plot, and that data was captured in VegCap. For the soil samples, we used the bucket soil auger to collect a soil sample to the depth of 10 centimeters, because that's seen as the rooting depth of these grasses or plants in the grassland, and that were then used to analyze the carbon and nitrogen. And the core sample was collected in order for us to determine bulk density. So the vegetation classification was done in JUICE using a modified twin span analysis, and thereafter alpha diversity was determined after the Bronblanquet values were transformed to a numerical scale, and then we determined the species richness as well as the diversity. So the diversity was estimated per site for each growth form, as well as for the pairs that was done separately in R using the IMER test package. And then the core method was used to determine the soil bulk density, and the samples that was collected with the soil auger were used to determine the carbon and nitrogen using the LICO TrueSpec CNS analyzer. And then the organic carbon and nitrogen stocks were determined, after which a single factor ANOVA was done to determine the difference between the carbon and the nitrogen, as well as look at the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So now we will have a little bit of a look at the results. So for the classification, in the table you will see that there are certain columns that are indicated in red. The red is not as red as I thought it would be. And the vegetation classification resulted in 3 communities, 7 sub-communities, and 2 variants. There were, however, no difference between the fire breaks and the adjacent grassland as we initially thought there would be. This results is contradicting the findings of the very limited research on fire breaks. And the reason why this might occur or why our results might contradict the others is because other research were mostly focused on previous croplands. But there are, however, some interesting things in subcommunity 2.2, which is only composed of fire break plots and mostly dominated by the herb Cuneiza podocephala. And this subcommunity is also the one that contains the least number of species. On the contrary, subcommunity 3.1 is only composed of adjacent grassland plots and mostly dominated by Cyprus longus, which might be indicative of the presence of moisture. Although fire is absent in this subcommunity, it does not have the highest number of species. So then, using the numerical values for each species, it is evident that some of the species prefer to occur in the adjacent grassland areas indicated in green, and we will have a little bit of a discussion about that. So grasses such as Tristachia leucothrix is known to occur in conservation grasslands. Heteropogon contortus, Parobulus fimbriatus, and Helictotrichon tergirium is also worth mentioning due to their preference for occurring in unburnt areas. For the herbs, Helichrysum auranitens is also worth mentioning with high cover or high numerical values in the unburnt areas. And then in terms of the bulbs, Pelargonium, Gladiolus, and Acalifa is also preferring the unburnt areas. With regards to the burnt areas, we can see that the grasses such as Hyperhenia tamba and Hirta mostly dominate, especially along the roads, and research indicate that areas dominated by these two species seldom progress to more diverse ecological state. Eragrostis curvula is also worth mentioning here. Then we look at the alien invasive species Ricardia brasiliensis, which is also much more prominent in the firebreaks than the adjacent grassland. And lastly, we look at the Meda triandra, for which there is a little bit of controversy. Certain literature says that it is associated with firebreaks, whereas others says that there's no association with fire at all. If we look at the diversity, there's no significant difference that we could find between the species richness or diversity between the treatments, which are firebreaks and adjacent grasslands, nor between the different growth forms found in the grassland. Our research are once again contradicting the findings of other researchers who found that graminoid diversity and species richness are higher in firebreaks. In terms of the soil, once again, no significant difference was found between the nitrogen and carbon stocks, nor between the nitrogen and carbon ratios of the firebreaks and adjacent grasslands. Local studies in the area, however, indicate that nitrogen and carbon concentrations are much higher in the adjacent grasslands than in the firebreaks. This conflicting results can be attributed to the variation in soil type, fire behavior, as well as the seasonal fluctuation that occur. However, trends in our research suggest an increase in carbon stocks in the adjacent grassland when compared to the firebreaks. So in conclusion, although our findings contradict the findings of other research on firebreaks with no difference in vegetation or soil properties, we conclude that the Eastern Free State sandy grassland vegetation are relatively resilient against annual fires using only one season's data. More research is, however, needed in relation to firebreaks, and we recommend that the research should focus on vegetation composition and diversity as well as soil properties. It is also recommended that the research be done over more than one growing season, and we also advise that the researchers should look at the effect of fire on geophytes, parasites, and shrubs. I would like to thank the Central Research Fund at the University of the Free State and Sandparks for allowing us access to the Golden Gate Highlands National Park. Our research has recently been published in Diversity, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting study, and fire breaks are obviously a system that is available to be studied to look at those sorts of contrasts, and more fire break studies would be really interesting in future. But thank you very much. You've got 25 seconds for one question. Thanks for sticking to time. Anyone with a question? Yes, at the back.
Sorry, maybe I missed it. The adjacent grassland, was it also bent maybe every second year?
Not that we know of. So the fires in Golden Gate come through when they want to. For instance, like last year, around 70 to 80% of the park actually burned down. So we are not really sure about the fire history of the adjacent grassland, but so we know that the fire breaks burn every year.
Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot. That's all we've got time for, but thank you very much for an interesting talk. And then we move on to our last talk before tea, and that is Tumbedzo Ramaleva. And the talk is on investigating response of forb and grasses, below ground regeneration traits to disturbance. Thank you.
Okay. All right, thanks. As Prof. Kickman said, my name is Tumbedzo Ramaleva, so I'll just give you a preliminary result. This is part of my PhD, where we are looking at the below ground regeneration traits of forbs and grasses in the national park. This one. Okay, so one can say, why do we have to care about this below ground bud bank and their bud bearing organs? So what we know so far is that in our open ecosystem, the high portion of our biomass is below ground. So what you see above ground is just a small percentage of the entire biomass. And then these bud bearing organs and the bud banks, they facilitate a dynamic response to disturbance and also support a diverse assemblage of species. Because what they also do, they also assist in terms of clonal growth, resource acquisitions, and also competitive ability, and also, again, responding to disturbance. Therefore, changing the frequency of this natural disturbance, your fire or the pressure of the herbivores, in this open system has the potential to modify the coexistence dynamics based on how these bud-bearing organs and the bud banks respond to the disturbance. So, like I said, bud-bearing organs and the bud banks are pretty much important. But then what we know so far is that relying on these above ground traits is often a poor predictor of functions in savannas, because we are not getting the full picture of how these forbs and grasses or savanna plants respond to this disturbance. But then the question can become, okay, you're going to do this bud bank and stuff, then how do we utilize this knowledge? Once we know this, how they respond to fire and herbivore, what do we do? So this is the base of my PhD, getting more knowledge on how the below ground bud bank and the bud bearing organs respond to fire, so that result, we kind of shed a light on what we've been observing above ground, because we know quite a lot of how the above ground traits respond to different fire and herbivore treatments. So to do this, we then came up with few questions just to look at. So the first question will be, does the composition or the type of these bud-bearing organs and their density depend on the frequency of fire and herbivore or natural disturbance? And then is there any difference between the forb and the grass below ground bud banks in terms of how they respond to this fire and herbivore? And then lastly, we look at, is there any relationship between the density of bud-bearing organs and the density of the bud banks? So, like I said, this study was done in the Kruger National Park, specifically the Satara and Ngwanetsi experimental band plots. So we focused on three fire frequencies. So the blue one is the triennial, which is bent every 3 years. The red one is the annual, and the yellow one is the unbent. So this is the picture of the Satara EPBs for those who know the Satara band plots. And then we also assembled a control just adjacent the annual. The control is not bent. So, like I said, we focus on the annual, triennial, and bend, and the control. So within these bend plots, there are what we call herbivore exclosures. So these are just exclosures that exclude, this one's the full exclosure, to exclude all the large mammalian herbivores. And then what we did, we sampled 5 quadrats inside the exclosures and 5 quadrats outside the exclosures. So all in all, because remember, we're doing this in Satara and Wanit. So all in all, we had 70 quadrats, 20 in the annual, 20 in the triennial, 20 in the unbanned, and then 10 in the control, because the control doesn't have the herbivore exclosures. So we didn't do the inside the exclosures. So in all of this quadrat, we firstly, so they were one by one. We did a species comp inside the one by one. Then after doing the species comp, we reduced the quadrat into half a meter quadrat. That's where we dig to a depth of 15 centimeters, because birds are found mostly between, I think, 10 to 15 centimeters. And then after digging this half a meter, we then sieved the soil so that we can get the below ground samples. And then after that, at night, we had to wash all the samples and store them in this 2-liter containers containing 70% of ethanol. And then this was transported to the lab for bird counting and also recording the bird-bearing organ steps. So for stats, we just looked at some tests just to detect if there's any correlation between bird-bearing organ density and the treatment, the fire and herbivory, and also did some generalized linear mixed modeling to test if the response of forbs and grass bird banks density is it related to any, or is it related to the fire treatment? And then treatments, growth forms, and also the blocks, which are the replicates, were considered as factors. And then this was all done in R using the ggplot and the GLM package. So these are some of the results that we're observing so far. So what we managed to observe so far is that there are 6 bird-bearing organ types that are mostly dominating or found throughout these treatments. So I've just included just 4 pictures of those. So it's non-woody rhizome and stolon. These are associated with grasses. We've got bulb, we've got root crown, we've got root tuber, and the woody rhizome, which are associated with forbs. And then what we noticed that although when you look at the image at the plot, you'll think, okay, there is different, but statistically, there's no difference in terms of their density across all the treatment. And then in terms of the treatment, AA is annual without herbivore, AP is annual with herbivore, then the CP is the control with herbivores, and then TA is triennial without herbivores, TP triennial with herbivores, annual without herbivores, that's the UA, and then the UP is annual with herbivores. And then after this, okay, now we know which bird-bearing organs and what are their density across the treatments. Now let's look at the forb and the grass bird bank. So before that, another key function of these bird-bearing organs is that they provide bird banks for seasonal renewal and also for regeneration after disturbance. Okay, that's me. So when we look at the bird bank density of the forbs and the grasses, so what I did first was to look at total bird bank density across all the treatments. I just kind of lumped the forb with the grass, and then what? Okay. Oh yeah. So this is the total bird bank density across all the treatments. So what we'll notice is that this is the annual with herbivore, triennial with herbivore, and unbanned with the herbivores. So what we'll notice is that when fire frequency is reduced and when fire is excluded in the presence of herbivores, total bird density is lower compared to the annual band plots. And then when you look at the very same fire frequencies or plots, annual, triennial, and unbanned, in the absence of herbivores, now the pattern is it's opposite to what we observed. The total bird density is a bit higher or it's higher when compared to the annual ones. So this is quite interesting. We still have to find out why, because what we are also going to do now is to look at specific bud bank density. We look at the dominant forbs and grasses and see how do they respond to these treatments, and can we use that result to explain what we're observing here. And then when I look at when I now look at the bud bank density of grasses and forbs separately, we found that the density of grass bud bank also doesn't significantly vary across the treatment. The same was for forbs. But then when we compare the two growth forms, their bud density is different. So, but this was expected because forbs and grasses are morphologically, anatomically, whatever, functionally different. So we expected something like this. And then what we then do was, okay, is there any relationship between the density of these bud-bearing organs and the density of the bud bank? The more you have, let's say, for example, you have got more non-woody rhizomes. Does that mean you might have more bud bank density of grasses? And the result here, we can say yes, although there's still some stuff that has to be done here to fully understand and get all the groupings and the overlaps. But then so far, I can say there is a positive relationship between the density of the bud-bearing organs and the density of the bud bank. So, okay, this is a conclusion for now. Total bud bank density varies between these two growth forms. This was expected, like I said. And also remember, our system is C4 dominated. So we more or less expected grasses to dominate the bud bank density. And then assessing this below ground bud bank density provide perspective about the forb and grass regeneration capacity. So what we found here was that there's not much plasticity within the growth forms. So the grass bud bank density does not vary, but there is a difference between the two life form. And then the third one was that if you remember the total bud bank density slide, you will have noticed that the triennial without herbivore had the highest bud bank density. And then when you go a slide back, triennial without herbivores also had the highest density of the bud-bearing organs. So this might mean that this particular treatment provide the right balance of disturbance to sustain diverse and resilient community, which is capable of regeneration. Because let me just add, there is a student who is doing the seed bank in these very same plots, and what you are observing is actually opposite. Where there's high bud bank density, there appears to be low seed bank. So it's quite interesting. And yeah, we'll look forward to those results. Yeah, thanks to these organizations, my professors and everyone. And thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for a question before we break for tea. I see we've got two questions, so we'll take both of those. First one here, the second at the back.
Thank you for that presentation. Do you perhaps also think climatic variables will have a significant difference within those three plots compared to herbivory and fire?
Yeah, that is possible, but I think we'll look into that in the future. I can't really say no, they are not important. There is possibility. Unfortunately, we didn't really look into that. We're more focused on fire and herbivore, but it is possible.
Thank you. And then I think it's Notando at the back.
Thank you, Tumbezo, for the nice presentation. It is really interesting. I think it's just two questions in one. I see you focused on the 3-year bans, the 1-year bans. and you mentioned unbans and controls. So the first question, I want to find out if on the 3-year bans, you did all the months, because we have the April, we have the August, we have the October, we have the December, and we have the control in each string, like the 3 years and the annuals. So I want to know which ones did you consider as your no bans?
Are you referring to the fire season in terms of the,
Yes.
when do they ban?
Okay, the EBPs in the Kruger, they have the triennial, the 3-year ban ones, right? Then they are separated in months, like in the seasons.
Yes.
We have April, August, October, December, then there's a control. So in 3-year bans, we have 5 replicate. Let me put it like this. Maybe 5, let me just say 5 months, including the control. I'll put it as a month. Then the 2 years, we also have 5. We have April, August, the ones that they ban in April, the ones that ban in August, the one that ban in October, and the December ones and the control. So I'm just a bit confused on which ones did you consider as your unban?
Okay, my time is up, but
Discuss.
But I focused on the annual ban, which they ban every year, the 3-year ban, and the unban. And in terms of when do they ban, they mostly ban around August.
Okay. All right. So which means you focused on the August ones.
Yeah, August
All right.
ones.
Thank you.
All right.
Answered.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk, and I think the below ground things, happenings with fire are something that's really neglected. We need more below ground studies. Thank you very much for that. Round of applause, please. Right, and that brings us to the end of the session. We'll break for tea and we'll meet again in half an hour's time. Thank you.